This is the sound of a congregation of albatrosses and perhaps other seabirds at sea. And these are part of the really extensive library of sounds that form Seabird Soundscapes, and a really interesting project. And I'm speaking in this episode with the founder and the person who's going to do the bulk of the work for this project. It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. We're talking seabirds, the sounds of seabirds, with Aline Da Cerqueira. I think I got that pretty right. Hello, Aline. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and to talk about my work and seabird sounds.
It's a pleasure. Well, you've done the introduction for me. The Seabird Soundscapes project. Let's start with what is it and how did the idea come about?
Well, it's a very nice story. Actually, a few years ago, I was looking for a PhD project to do my PhD research. I was very open-minded about it. I had worked before with marine mammals and I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, except for I wanted to continue working in marine conservation. And I was interested in exploring new methods in marine conservation. And I came across this researcher from the Zoological Society of London. And he said, well, I've got a pretty good data set, acoustic data set from Albatross, from Bird Island in South Georgia. And then I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then he said, well, what do you think of exploring this data set and see what it reveals? And I thought that was very interesting. I didn't know then what he meant about exploring that data set, but then I started reading about acoustic ecology and reading about albatrosses. And then I thought, well, I think this is interesting, perhaps learning about the ecology of seabirds from listening to the sounds they make at sea. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. So the next thing that happened was that grabbed that data set and started to listen to it at home, transferred that huge amount of acoustic data to my computer. And then I thought, well, I am new to seabirds and I am new to acoustic ecology. So how am I going to approach this? And then I decided to listen to nearly 700 hours of albatross sounds. And that was absolutely fascinating. I could have opted to use machine learning. I could have used other acoustic indices methods to help me to classify my sound data set, but I decided to do it manually to become a bit more familiar with the sounds and the environment really of seabirds at sea. So that is how the idea first emerged, using the seabird sounds during their foraging trips to find out exactly what seabirds are doing. So we know that when seabirds go to the sea, they spend most of their time engaging in foraging activity, searching for food and feeding, obviously. But we don't know the types of interactions they have with other animals and perhaps with fishing vessels at sea. And then there are quite a few methods out there which are used to investigate seabird movement. And you can tell patterns of foraging behavior from seabird movement, of course. But when you tag an animal with a GPS tracker or a geolocator, for example, you have information about one single individual. And the interesting thing about acoustic recordings is that it records the sounds that individual, the tagged individual, is producing, but also records sounds of its surroundings. So, which includes sounds made by other seabirds and potentially other animals, and also of encounters with fishing vessels, etc. So that's very interesting to increase the resolution into the behavior of these animals at sea when you can't see them. So the initial data set I worked with are from two species of albatross, wandering albatross and black-browed albatross, both of them from a colony in Bird Island, South Georgia. Tiny, teeny island, but full of seabirds and wildlife, as you know. And these animals are really loud and absolutely gorgeous. And so those first data sets from these two species reviewed some interesting information about, for example, that from listening to seabird soundscape, we are able to identify areas in the open ocean where animals congregate. We can't tell at the moment, and I'm not sure if you will be able to tell that in the future, how many animals are congregating there. But from the sounds we recorded, you can tell that there are quite a few animals in there, and including other species as well. So we're talking about multi-species congregations at sea. And that's usually where there is quite a lot of water sounds as well. So paddling, dipping, and splashing, which indicates that birds are actively feeding, quarreling, and it's very interesting. And sometimes, it's quite quiet as well, and all you can hear is some tapping and scratching sounds, which probably come from when birds are preening, preening behavior. And they could just be stuck on the water surface because there's no wind for them to take off and fly anywhere else. So it's very interesting.
Aline, I think we're used to how the GPS locators work, where they're attached with a harness, or perhaps for some birds, if they're able to be attached by some other method. But how are the audio, their recorders, I'm guessing? What are you using to collect the sounds, and how are they attached to the birds?
So the first sound recorders we used are sound recorders called EDIC Mini, which are very small. They are like 3 by 3 centimeters in terms of dimension, and they are very light. And we attach them to the rear feathers of the birds. So they are attached with tesa tape. And the GPS tags are also miniature GPS tags, and they are attached together in the same area, trying to avoid any discomfort to the birds. But you can tell that sometimes they're not very happy with that. They are probably thinking, what is this doing here? And then you hear loads of tapping of them, tapping with the beak directly on the recorders.
And how long do the recorders last, and how is the data collected? Is it transmitted, or do you need to recover the bugs?
We need to recover them. So in my research, we deployed both the GPS and the sound recorders during the brooding season when they are rearing their chicks. And so that's the couples, they take turns going to the sea and to bring food back. So usually we are talking about foraging trips that may last from 2 to 6 days. So because there is a British Antarctic survey, headquarters in the area. So researchers always have an eye out for returning birds and when they can go to the nest and recover the tags. So yes, we need to deploy and collect them. And usually, the whole process between deployment and retrieval takes within a week.
Now, how many trips have you made down there?
I haven't yet, unfortunately.
Well, that's pretty lucky, isn't it? Having someone outsource to do all the hard work, and they just ship back the audio to you.
So it's great to have some amazing collaborators who have been working with seabirds for decades, really. So one of the collaborators in this work is Professor Richard Phillips from the British Antarctic Survey, who has been working with seabirds from the Antarctic region for a long time, and he was the one going there, and he was lucky to go there and collect these acoustic data sets for this research. And I was hoping that perhaps I would be able to go as well, to go and collect some more data. But then, the pandemic hasn't made things easier for traveling, unfortunately. So I couldn't, for example, collect more data last year, and I'm still unsure whether I'll be able to collect data this year. Luckily, I have been working with other species as well, which I can talk to you about.
Well, let's talk about your specific project to start with, because you started off with over 700 hours of data that had already been collected and was sitting there in the bowels of the university waiting for someone to do something with it. So what was the first task after physically listening to all of those recordings? And I might note for listeners who haven't caught up with all of the shows, Danny Teixeira has been studying glossy black cockatoos with a bioacoustic method, and there's another episode coming up with Fiona Backhouse with lyrebirds again. Now, I know Danny did some analysis with machine learning, but how long did it take you to obviously listen to 700 hours? You're listening for 700 hours, but you're also sorting and cataloguing, I guess, while you're doing it, making notes and organising it to fit your workflow. So how long did that analysis stage take?
It took months. It took months because I had to learn it from scratch, really. And I had to devise my own method because there are quite a few interesting researchers out there about passive acoustic monitoring, for example, but not many studies that have recorded sounds from animal-borne recorders. So that's a different perspective. While in acoustic ecology, usually you record the sounds of the entire environment and then you characterize the environment and the sounds from your recordings. And when you use animal-borne recorders, you have that individual's perspective, what that individual is going through. And so it was interesting to listen and to then start classifying the sound. So the first question I asked was, what types of sounds can I distinguish from these recordings? And then the first type of sound that it was very easy to identify was flight, not only because of the initial flapping, you can clearly hear the wing beat, but because of the soaring, when animals are, because I worked initially with Albatross, and Albatross has a specific way of flying because it is, that wingspan is amazing and makes a lot of noise. It's like sometimes listening to a jet, for example. So I could easily pick the sounds of flight from my waveform and spectrogram displays and single those out. And then I had to investigate the other sounds.
Now, can I just jump in there, Aline, with the sound? Is that the air rushing over the recorder that makes it sound like a jet, or is it the sound of the wind over the feathers? What was the? I'm guessing it was a whooshy sound.
It is a whooshy sound, a strong whooshy sound, and that's mainly the wind. That's mainly the wind, and but also the sounds of the wind and going through the feathers, and then you can actually hear the feathers as well, adjusting or moving with the wind. So it is a powerful sound. And some occasional flapping, especially from black-browed albatross. And they are smaller, and you will hear more flapping, but still mainly whooshing sounds, and it's great.
You mentioned the spectrograms and the sort of audiograms. Now, I'm familiar with what they look like because I'm always editing podcasts, and I use a program that uses like a 3D spectrogram, and most people will be familiar with the waveforms that you see for recordings. They've been characterized in movies and cartoons and stuff forever. One of the things that you get taught when you're doing any kind of audio production is not to listen with your eyes, but when you're looking at the spectrograms. But I'm guessing that listening with your eyes is part of the way that you save time because you recognize the visual patterns in the spectrograms, whichever type they are, 2D or 3D. Is that something that you used, or did you actively listen to every recording and catalogue it only using your ears, not your eyes?
I used both, and I think it is great that I was able to use both because, for example, especially in waveform, a very loud, you can distinguish a very loud sound straight away
The
when you
spike.
are, yes, the spikes. And because these animals are flying long distances, is easy to spot in a waveform. Like my recordings, they were in average 5 hours long, each file. So I noticed straight away that when animals are flying, whether because the flight sound is very loud or because animals don't vocalize, often the only sound I could hear during flight was actually flight. So straight away, every time I opened a file, I realized, okay, I'm going to focus on the sounds that are in between flights, which corresponds to when the animals are floating on the surface. And that was important because, of course, I could have listened to a whole 5 hours of audio, but I had 700 hours. So it was easier for me to straight away to single out my flight sounds and focus on the periods when the animals were on the sea surface, which is when I could record other types of sounds and identify some other types of behavior. So the first thing I did was to separate those two types of sounds, generally flight and non-flight, and then I could delve into the non-flight periods to listen to other types of sounds.
You'd mentioned that you had two species that you started studying, but that had branched out to other species. What did you initially learn about the two species that you had first, the wandering and the black-browed albatross? And what caused you to extend the breadth of the study?
So the first thing that I noticed was that I could corroborate some information that have been reported before about both species, that like black-browed albatross tends to spend longer periods of time on the sea surface compared to smaller albatross species. And it was interesting to observe, for example, that albatrosses, or wandering albatrosses, they are more vocal and they interact more with other albatrosses at sea. And so they seem to be more active in interacting, and they made more sounds that were associated with periods on the sea surface compared with black-browed albatross. So black-browed
sorry,
albatross.
Aline. Sorry, Aline. I just want to stop you there. The wandering albatross are vocalizing more and interacting more with other albatross, you said. Now,
Yeah.
Is that other species, or is it their own wandering albatross buddies?
That is still hard to tell because the vocalizations of albatrosses, they are quite similar. Maybe there would be a way of differentiating between vocalizations of different albatross species, but that's something that we would need to really look into the acoustic features of vocalizations of one species and another, and then try to perhaps single out some features that are characteristics of each species. That I haven't been able to do.
That's probably a machine learning project, isn't it?
I agree with you. I think it would be easier to create a library of vocalizations of each species and try to look for specific features so that we can tag them and differentiate them and be able to identify. So that is a possible, something that is possible to be done in the near future.
Yeah, and it's easier for a computer to listen to 700 hours of and find the tonalities and whatnot that our ears don't actually recognize. So yeah, what made you branch out from the two species to include more species? Was it just because you had more species featuring in the audio that you had access to?
Well, the other species I am researching is the northern gannet, and I had the absolute pleasure to go and collect the data myself this time. I went to a small island of Pembrokeshire in the Welsh coast called Grassholm. And I did that in collaboration with another fantastic researcher, Professor Steve Vautier. And so he has been working with these northern gannets, well, this specific population of northern gannets for 15 years, I reckon. And he welcomed me in the team. And then a couple of years ago, I went to Grassholm to implement the same method, attaching a sound recorder, this time using a different type of audio recorder. I used an audio recorder called Audio Moth. And so it's quite popular in passive acoustic monitoring research, but this time I used audio moths and to attach on the back feathers of gannets together with a miniature GPS tag. And why gannets? Well, gannets, they are, in terms of behavior, they are quite different from albatrosses, obviously. They plunge dive, they interact very actively with fisheries, and with this particular colony in Wales, there is quite a lot is already known about them. So it was, and this researcher, Steve Vautier, he has been using, deploying also video cameras on those gannets. So could the video cameras validate my sound recordings. So that was one of the interesting things to do with his team. And it was brilliant. We collected a lot of data, also just under 700 hours of gannet data from 13 individuals. And it was amazing to actually spend a whole week with that colony, far away from everywhere else, and to learn a bit more about them. So the reason why we chose to work with a different species is because obviously the more data we are able to collect, the more we are able to adjust and fine tune our methods and discover the potential of these methods. And because we are talking about a species that interact quite a lot with fishing vessels, can we help protect seabirds by using acoustic recordings to find out where birds are interacting with fisheries, and are there any behavioral cues to that sort of interaction? So, as I said, it is a fairly new approach to seabird monitoring in the wild. So there is quite a lot that we are trying to extract from the acoustic data itself.
Can I go back to the tin tacks of collecting the data? You collected another 700 hours plus of the gannets. So how many birds do you use, and for how long are they carrying the equipment for you to get the 700 hours plus?
We had 13 birds. 13 birds were tagged, and we successfully collected audio data from all of them. And the recorders, they were on all the time, on continuous mode. In fact, I programmed them to stop recording sounds at night, just because gannets, they're not very active during, between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. But then during the rest of the day, we were continually collecting data, and the individuals were out at sea for up to 6 days as well, maybe longer. And sorry.
So from the time you put the tags on and the audio moth on to when you collected them, what was that span of time?
Yes, it was between up to 6 days.
So you managed to do it all within the 7-day period. So each bird's giving you about 100 hours of, well, slightly less, I would guess.
Absolutely, because some birds, they're going to stay at sea for 6 days. Some birds, they will return to the colony sooner. So there is this individual variation in foraging trip duration. So the amount of data collected by each individual will also vary because of this variation.
What did you find out? What have you discovered that's new to the world with albatrosses and with gannets?
Well, what I found out, first of all, going back to the albatross research, I found that I thought it was amazing to collect information about several individuals in locations at sea where you wouldn't be able to collect that sort of information otherwise. So that was fantastic, and that is a new insight from the perspective of monitoring these animals in the wild. I was a bit disappointed in that research because I was expecting to collect sounds from boat engines. I was expecting that albatrosses, they would intercept fishing vessels, and I really wanted to see whether sound recording is a good method to detect the presence of fishing vessels in the vicinity of the seabirds. I couldn't identify that with my albatross. Later on, when I plotted my foraging tracks in GIS, when I observed my seabirds tracks, I realized that out of the 10 birds that recorded data, 9 of them remained within the marine protected area of South Georgia, where fishing is illegal. So that's probably the reason why I didn't record sounds from fishing vessels. There was one bird, a wandering albatross, that flew really far away, not far from the Falkland Islands, actually. And that bird could potentially have intercepted fishing vessels, but I couldn't detect still any fishing boat engines. With my Gannet data, however, I recorded loads of boat engines, and that was really nice. It's very clear and it's very easy as well to see that in a map where those boats are. I am currently still classifying my Gannet data, so I don't have many results yet. But one exciting finding is possible to record sounds, automatic, sounds like man-made sounds, let's say, using that sort of approach. So I'm happy about that.
The albatross, where 9 of the birds are staying in the marine protected area, sort of begs a question, doesn't it? Do the birds know that's a safe area? Do you think they learned that, or is that just totally coincidence?
I think it is probably a coincidence, but that's hard to tell. Reading loads of papers on albatross distribution at sea, you can see that many papers will report that many albatross, especially during during the breeding season and the brooding season, they are going to stay near the colony. They want to save energy so that they can return soon to the colony to feed their young. So it makes sense that during that period of their lives, they are going to remain reasonably close to the colony. And the marine protected area is quite large, but it is still mainly around the coastal area of the archipelago. So I suppose they do that because it is that time in the season.
And hopefully, because it is protected, it's resource rich. It's a good place to be fishing rather than having to go somewhere else.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Probably more work needed on that, but I kind of like to think that because albatrosses are so long lived, that they get wise and they think, well, there's no boats coming into this area, so this is where we'll hang out. With the albatrosses particularly, did your work reinforce any of the thoughts of any of the researchers who had gone before you working with that population of albatross?
I guess so. For example, there are quite a few papers on seabird energetics, albatross energetics, flight energetics, and it's very interesting that there are quite a few reports out there saying that very often, when especially large species such as wandering albatross, when they are on the sea surface, it's not necessarily because they are foraging, but it could be because they are stuck in there because of the lack of environmental conditions for them to soar and take off. That's it. So they stay there and they will occasionally feed because you have this very long periods of silence where you will hear the occasional peck on the recorder or what is probably preening, the grooming, the feathers and things like that. And then occasionally you will hear like splashing sounds and paddling or water sounds in general. And then you think, well, you've got that albatross there, and then suddenly it spots a squid or something they're interested in, and then they just go there and take the opportunity to feed. So they are opportunistic feeders as well, when they are there. But I think that one of the reasons why they stay there for sometimes for long periods, hours, is because there is no wind. You can actually hear how quiet it is. And when it is very windy, the sound recorders picks that very well because it's loud.
One of the popular views of particularly the wandering albatross is that they are solitary beings traversing the expanses of the ocean, and then they return to their colony. They pair up with their lifelong mate, and they raise one or two chicks, and then at the end of breeding season, they're off on their solitary endeavours. Is your data backing up that view? Albatross is a solitary bird, or are they hanging out with their albatross friends? Do they maintain a pair bond while they're out at sea? Or is the popular sort of mythology of the albatross pretty close to the mark?
That's a very good question, and one that I don't really know what the answer is. Obviously, during the breeding season and the brooding season, these animals, they are committed to one goal, which is to raise their chicks. And all adult albatross reproducing that season are committed with that goal. So during that period of time, it is very likely that these animals will not fly very far away from the colony. And then you will observe these congregations of several species that are going to be there feeding. These are very visual animals as well. So maybe they are flying somewhere and then they change their minds because they spotted a few other birds feeding on the surface somewhere. So they go there because they need that feeding resource. So whether they are there socializing or just because they are spotting other birds feeding and they need to feed as well, that is the question. It certainly, from my data set, it certainly doesn't seem like albatrosses are solitary, because pretty much every time they are on the sea surface, I can hear other birds in the background. Whether they are albatrosses or not, they are there. So they are not really lonely. But out of the breeding season, it could be that these animals, they are more solitary. And that's hard to tell because there is quite a lot of data out there about albatross and seabird movement. But what's going on in the high seas is difficult because these are very long journeys, and the approach I use requires still the retrieval of the equipment. So I haven't got anything that's going to last more than a week at the moment. But if I could have, something, a recorder that's going to last a whole year, and it is still really small enough to deploy on a bird with a geolocator or a GPS tag, that would be great. That probably would reveal so much more about the behavior of the solitary bird.
Audio moth. You need to develop something that will last for 12 months.
Yes, at least, yeah.
Yeah, probably. Well, you're probably looking at 2 years or longer, aren't you? Because if they're an individual that doesn't manage to pair up and breed in that season, they're away. They're gone. Have you been able to add any knowledge to population data? You've been looking at your work particularly has been in sort of tight timeframes, but the populations are well studied. How are those populations doing in terms of replicating or maintaining their numbers?
In my work, I focus mainly on behavior from acoustic data. So I'm very much focused on those types of information, of course. What we know about seabirds in general is that we've got many species, including, the wandering albatross, that are threatened with extinction because their numbers are depleting and fast. And that depletion, that threat is actually associated with a variety of different impacts, fisheries being only one of them, but there are quite a few other impacts. In Bird Island and in South Georgia, I would say that the colonies there, they are quite well protected. One, if they are in the colony or if they are in the nearby sea, for example, because of the marine protected area. But these are very wide ranging animals, and it's really hard to be a seabird anyway, because you have to compete with fisheries all the time, and their food resources are impacted a lot by fishing activity globally. And yes, from my particular research, I don't know if I can right now say something about their populations, but I hope that the information that I'm producing will be able to perhaps inform decision makers rather, about where these birds are going for food and what is going on in these areas, what sort of species are going there, and what does it mean to have congregations of animals in specific locations that overlap with fishing activities? Can we move fishing activity somewhere else? Is there a better place to put? Because, fisheries, they still need to go on. But can we shape that in a better way? So I think that's one of the things I hope with this research is to use acoustic data to get a better idea about seabird behavior and how they interact with their surrounding environment, and how can that affect decision making and policy making.
Now, of course, I never miss an opportunity to promote an earlier episode. So, Pod, Dr. Ben Sullivan, that's, I think, episode 3 or 4. Go back and listen to that. And, dear listener, if you can, adopt a hook pod. Hook pod's a great way of helping reduce the bycatch of seabirds and make their life just a little bit easier. Now, Aline, I always like to imaginarily make a whole lot more work for you. So what do you think needs to be done to extend the work that you have been doing? What next kind of things people can find? What should they be designing the next study using by in the the marine environment, seabirds or associated species?
I think that sound is an amazing natural feature that contains a lot of information that is very useful to ecology and can be very useful to conservation. I think there are some amazing researchers out there that have already been published about the use of acoustic ecology and natural sounds and non-natural sounds as well, urban sounds, to help scientists and help people in general learn more about wildlife activity in a variety of settings. So, as a marine biologist, one of the difficulties I have is, for example, the technology I have been using lately, which is the device, which is audio moth. is being adapted now for use underwater. So this development is going to really help a lot the study in the aquatic environment. With my devices, like the devices I used on the individuals, I had to waterproof each recording device, which a sort of improvised case that would be light enough for me to deploy on the animals, of course. But that is not ideal because it creates quite a lot of friction sound. And so that creates a lot of noise that I need to basically remove from my audio data. So we need, in terms of technology, so I think the future developers could be trying to solve some of these issues, create miniaturized recording devices that can be deployed directly on animals and small animals as well, and they can be waterproofed easily, or they come already with a waterproof case. That would be like the dream thing to use if you're talking about deploying them on birds in general. There are quite a few devices out there, including audio mods, that they have a protective case for you to use in a variety of weathers, but not really underwater yet. They are testing the underwater case, and that's really awesome because then you can listen to sounds underwater and you don't need to be there. Like, for example, when you're doing bioacoustic recordings, usually the researcher is nearby and is staying there for the duration of the recording. It's great to be able to dive and leave the recorder there for a whole week and then come back 1 week later or 2 weeks later and then come and collect and analyze that. So I think we are close to that time when we are going to have more devices in the market, and they are accessible in price and they are flexible in relation to where you're going to be using them in terms of environment.
After I spoke to Danny Texera and she mentioned AudioMoth, I went and had a look at their website, and it looks like the way you access getting a new one is it's like crowdfunding. They say we're going to do a new release, and then everyone sort of pitches in and says, "I'll have 5, I'll have 10," and it's a bit like a Kickstarter or something like that for every round of their development. Is that how you secured yours?
We're already secured by a different project at the Institute of Zoology of the Zoological Society of London. So I used the devices that were already there, but we are going to buy more audio moths. They developed a mini audio moth, a micro audio moth, which is much smaller than the previous devices, which is going to facilitate enormously working with seabirds or any sort of birds I would expect. So much smaller, much lighter. And yes, we buy them in large batches. So, okay, I want 100, you want another 200, and someone else wants, I don't know, 300. And then we are going to place an order together. That helps with regards to cost, of course. So the more you buy, the cheaper it is for you to acquire them.
And of course, once the university or the department has got them, they're going to be used again and again until the end of their functional life. So
absolutely,
they're going to add a lot of data. Yeah. Now, Alina, you mentioned to me before we hit the go button that you are new to the bird nerd world, that you, as a marine biologist, you weren't really a bird person, but that you've become, obviously, how can you work with albatrosses and not become a bird person? I need to ask you one of our bird emergency questions, which is what field guide are you using as a sort of newcomer? What book did you take with you when you what's the field guide that you started off with when you started to become familiar with seabirds?
field guide. I wouldn't say much of a field guide, but a great introduction to the seabird world for me was an amazing book called Far from Land: The Mysterious Lives of Seabirds by Michael Brook. And that has been for me, it was the best thing I could have done because it talks about the natural lives of seabirds, but not in a only in a technical way. Don't get me wrong, Michael Brook is an amazing seabird researcher and specialist for a long time. But it's just that his book has a very good narrative. So that was great. It doesn't talk only about albatrosses, it talks about all seabird species out there. It refers to some very interesting studies and other books and peer-reviewed articles, which have been very helpful because I was new to the seabird world, and I still feel like there are so many seabird nerds out there that when I am around them, I feel like, oh, I know nothing. I still know nothing. I'm still trying to catch up with the seabird knowledge. And they are very well studied animals, and there are people who have spent, the totality of their professional lives is studying them, or even as a hobby people are really knowledgeable. I'm definitely not there yet, but trying to catch up and fast.
Now, has the joy of seabirds into other parts of your life? Like, have you now started to identify the little brown birds in the garden? Have you bought a new set of binoculars? Are you looking at other birds with wonder and amazement nowadays?
Totally. I have joined on Facebook, for example, I joined pretty much all birds groups that I have found. I come originally from Brazil, and Brazil has many colorful birds like land birds, and I've got many of my biologist friends are ornithologists, and they are very well accomplished ornithologists. So I have had the pleasure to spend time with them, sometimes on expeditions as a helper in the past, and now that I have been working with birds, well, seabirds, I have been paying more attention to birds around me, to the birds in my garden. And every time I go out, try to identify the bird by their sounds, their songs. And that's very interesting.
Are
And yes,
you
I did get a new pair of binoculars as well.
very good, very good. So, are you maintaining like a home list? Are you checking off the birds that you're seeing around you?
No, I haven't been doing that, and I haven't done that yet. But I have considered doing that. I do have a good friend who has a amazing list of more than 400 or 500 birds. And yes, my husband, he is a bit of a bird nerd as well. So it's very interesting to be around these people who are really paying attention to all the birds around them.
Now, does your husband have the bird alert set up on Twitter or some other app, and the vultures up in the Midlands and then head off?
No, he's not at that level, but one of my good friends from Devon, he is at that level, and he will travel miles and miles, to see that seabird or that bird in general.
Yeah, or that vulture. That's the famous one in Britain lately, isn't it?
There was
the vulture
a black-browed
that
albatross.
that was only in the last week. I did see that, and it was, and I saw a picture on Twitter that it was resting comfortably amongst a colony of gannets. So
Absolutely, there
that
were
was a
some
beauty.
very interesting tweets about that.
Yeah. So, well, we've established there that you're at the lesser end of the spectrum, but your friend from Devon is right up the twitcher end of the spectrum. Have you, in your work with the seabirds, have you developed a favourite bird?
I always liked the birds of the Salidae family. Um, Gannets in within my research, of course, I loved albatrosses and black-browed albatross. You know, those eyes are very captivating. But the gannets, they are really stunning birds. And years back, I did a internship in a very small archipelago off the coast of Brazil, and I spent 6 months living in one of the islands of the archipelago with loads of masked boobies. And I used to dive a lot during that period. And one of the most fantastic memories I've got is of me diving sometimes, I don't know, 6 meters, 10 meters underwater and seeing the boobies plunge diving above me, you know, and that was both scary and magnificent. And since then, I have been really big fan of the animals of that family. So it is amazing to be working with gannets now because they are very similar in the way they look and the way they behave during foraging as well.
I think gannets always seem like they're the stuffy upper class members of the family, and the boobies are just the bumbling idiots.
Yes, I
um,
think boobies are really beautiful and quite clever. They are very good at stealing research equipment from you when you're not looking.
really, what did they pilfer from you?
So I was in this archipelago doing some research with humpback whales, and my work was to observe humpback whales' behavior from land. It was a fixed point observation work, and they would it's still like anything that shined, that you know, pens and notepads with shining, I don't know, shiny, how do you
With a
say,
reflective cover or anything like that?
thing that was shiny, really.
Spiral binding.
Yes, those spiral bondings, and they would steal that and take them to their nests. So at the end of the day, I had to go around nests to pick.
And are they using them as decoration?
I don't really know if it is for decoration or if they think that's something good for the structure of their nests. Who knows?
Whether they're builders or designers. Yeah. Wow. I hadn't heard that about boobies. But we all love boobies. Eleni, what's next for you? Like, how far along is your project?
Okay, so my PhD itself is, I've got one last year to complete it, which is very scary because the pandemic really meant that, you know, a few things didn't go according to my initial plan. But I'm catching up with the work that I didn't do during the past year or so. And so, what is next? I've got a Citizen Science project that we are going to be officially launching next week on Tuesday. The name of the project is Seabird Soundscape, and it is hosted by the citizen science platform Zooniverse. So if you go on Zooniverse and search for Seabird Soundscapes next week, you will find our project there, and anyone can engage with this project and basically help me classify my data. So there are loads of sounds there, sounds of gannets flying, a lot of flight sounds, vocalizations as well. And yeah, and sounds of water, boat engine. So that's a different method than the one I used in the previous work with Albatross. And so hopefully I will get loads of people to help me classify my data.
Well, by the time this goes out to the world, you will have opened up access to Seabird Soundscapes. So, what will somebody need to do to help you out? What's the actual process they will undergo?
Well, when they go to the page, the Seabird Soundscapes page, there is an icon there. Well, there is a page called Classify, where you are going to, you just press Classify, and then you're going to have a snippet of 10 seconds with a spectrogram and the sound of, corresponding to those 10 seconds. And then that sound is going to be either flight, vocalization, other animals, a different sound. And then the person listening to those 10 seconds will basically identify which of those sounds it is. And yes, and just choose from the options there. You can choose more than one option if that's the appropriate answer, and then submit it. So every time that classification is done, that's more data that's been classified for me. And that's going to help me in the next stage of my research, which is basically use those sound classifications to train a machine learning algorithm to classify the data automatically. So now I'll be in that stage where I'm going to, to be using automated methods to help me classify all the data sets.
You're well aware that not everybody tells the truth when they go to something like that. So you'll have many people listen to each snippet. So is that the plan, so that you weed out the people who deliberately say, yes, that was a motorboat engine. Yes, that really was.
Absolutely. So the more people who say that, 6 people classify one same subject and attribute a specific type of sound, the same specific type of sound to that subject, that means that subject has been classified with a high level of confidence.
Of certainty, yeah, good.
Of certainty. And I will still not classify the whole thing, but I'm going to take a sample to make sure that data have been classified appropriately, just to, as a validation stage.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, we love the Citizen Science Project, which is why I looked you up. And, we've managed to jam in a couple of threatened species, so it fits my remit. But I really wanted to make sure that many more people find out about the Seabird Soundscapes project, because I think it's, well, I'm pretty sure it's a first. I don't think there's many others who have used this kind of method before, but it seems eminently sensible for many other people who are doing bioacoustic work to sort, classify their countless hours of data. Now, I'm guessing that once you have finished your PhD, Aline, that the library of sounds will then be available to other researchers to build on.
Absolutely. I have a few other collaborators with whom I probably won't have the opportunity to work with during my PhD, but there is still plenty of work to be done out there using the data set I've got and combining my data set with theirs. There is this amazing researcher in Canada, Rachel Buxton. She has been working with passive acoustic monitoring of seabird colonies for quite a few years. And one of the colonies she has been researching more recently is the same colony of my wandering and black-browed albatross. So we are hoping to do a research together using colony soundscapes and seabird soundscapes and explore that together and develop a study based on our data sets. And there is also this researcher from Germany who is focused on echoacoustics, and she works with acoustic indices, and we are trying to implement her method and combine with my method and my data sets and see what comes out of it. And there is also the possibility of using this method, which is the animal-borne sound recordings with other species, not necessarily of seabirds. So one of the things that I'm planning to explore after my PhD is a long-term collaboration I have with a NGO in Brazil working with marine mammals. So we are hoping to capture the sounds of manatees using this technology and try to understand a bit more about the soundscapes of manatees in the wild. They are endangered species, and these manatees specifically, they are being reintroduced into the natural environment. So it would be interesting to see what they are experiencing out there, whether they are going to be meeting wild manatees and whether they are forming their own bonds. So there is a lot to be done after my PhD, and I'm really keen to still continue to work with acoustic ecology, both from born perspective and perhaps passive acoustic monitoring perspective.
There's always more to be done, isn't there? It's amazing. Every time you open a door, there's another hallway to walk down and another door to open. Aline, it's been terrific meeting you and hearing about your work. I really do encourage people to check out Seabird Soundscapes project, and of course, Aline's going to give me all the information I need to make it easy for you to find your way there and take part. Because, hey, citizen science, why not? Let's all get into it. Aline, I wish you all the best with that. And, gee, I'd love to be put in touch with those other researchers so that we can maybe explore some of the work that they've been doing as well. You're not the first person I've spoken to who's had to be trying to get research done during the pandemic, and it's a struggle. And look, good on you. You're a trooper for getting through, and I'm sure that in 12 months' time, we'll be talking to Dr. Aline.
I hope so. I'm very much looking forward to that. And thank you so much for having me. It's been so great chatting to you. And yes, thanks for the opportunity, and hope we can chat again another time.
I'm sure we will. Because we've got to get to the end of your project and check out your results. And and I'd love to hear about the process of defending your work, because that always fascinates me.
That sounds like a good plan. Looking forward to that.
Well, Aline Da Cerqueira from Brazil via London, terrific to speak to you. I'm Grant Williams. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks, Aline.
Thank you.
Since I recorded that conversation with Aline, she sent me an update. And this is what she said. The main update is that there have been over 19,000 classifications on Zooniverse so far. Soon, I'll update more gannet sounds from new individuals to the project site, and I'm starting to prepare my Albatross data to upload to the site too. All these should be done by the end of next month, which would be about now, which is very exciting, she goes on to say. Seabird Sounds will be online until 2023 at least. That's great. Get involved. Seabird Soundscapes. All the links in the information for the podcast.